Namaskar. Today's session, that is number 22nd, we will be discussing about operating exposure management. In session 21, we discuss the definition and issue of operating exposure. We also try to quantify the operating exposure through different examples. Today's session we will be discussing, once the operating exposure quantify, how you can manage the operating exposure through different process of management, starting from qualitative management principle to quantification, quantitative measurement, and also through different kind of derivative product which are available in the market, whether this derivative product can help us in managing the operating exposure. Once I mentioned the operating exposure, we should understand that these operating exposures are long term in nature. This exposure affect the value of the company and also try to address the issue of competitive condition of the company. When operating exposure affect the long term value of the company and try to hamper the competitiveness of the company, it cannot be managed through derivative product, because derivative products are short term in nature. Long term derivative product very difficult to get from the market. In at present worldwide, the derivative products are short term in nature. So, the management of operating exposure can be done only through strategic level, through negotiation, through resourcing of raw materials, by reducing the overall cost of the company, by improving the efficiency of the company, and also through multiple selling unit, by diversification of financing pattern of the company and diversification of the nature of the business of the company. Let us discuss the different way of management of operating exposure. One such way we have discussed in our last example, that is in session 21, how the Walmart, the domestic Indian exporter, they arrive when the domestic Indian exporter export pen drive, and with the appreciation of domestic currency, how it affect the volume of sales, how it affect its profit position. And that time we understood that appreciation of domestic currency can be managed, or can be managed not in a overall way, can be managed at certain extent by negotiating for higher price with the importer, reducing the domestic labor cost, improving the manufacturing and delivery supply chain, and sourcing the low cost input from other country, producing at optimum level of operation, and exporting not only one currency area, but in multiple currency area, particularly in currency area where domestic currency depreciate or not appreciate significantly. These are some way we can address the issue of operating exposure, but management of operating exposure depends upon a pragmatic analysis of why operating exposure arises, and secondly, if it arises, what we can manage through instrument of marketing, through instrument of strategy value decision process, and also through using some kind of financial product. Let us discuss what are the process available to us or the methods available to us for management of operating exposure. Operating exposure, as I mentioned earlier, it affects the operational position, operational process of the company. So, we have to redesign the operational process, operational systems of the company. So, the management of operating exposure we can do through matching currency cash flow, that is one aspect, risk sharing agreement with the exporter or importer, going for back to back or parallel loans process, reinforcing that center, and through currency swap process. There are other way of doing also, that is called diversification of operating system and also diversification of financial decision. So, one by one today we will be discuss about this operating exposure. First way, matching currency cash flow. Matching currency cash flow is nothing but a type of what is called asset liability management. When a particular company exporting or importing, it either receiving or paying in foreign currency. If it is exporter, a receiving foreign currency, and it is a importer, it is paying foreign currency. This outflow inflow of foreign currency create operating exposure, because this outflow inflow were long term in nature. In long term, as I mentioned earlier, very difficult to predict the exchange rate. Exchange rate environment is uncertain, we cannot predict the exchange rate, and because of that the inflows and outflow of foreign currency create operating exposure. Suppose exporter is there, is exporting and getting foreign currency. So, if we try to find some way the exporter can get some kind equivalent amount of import in that particular currency, then this inflow and outflow will be matched, and this matching of foreign currency cash flow may reduce the operating exposure. So, what does it mean? The matching of cash flow is here, it focuses on matching the inflows and outflow of foreign currency. If domestic currency appreciate against contracted foreign currency, the export oriented company should pay its obligation in foreign currency so as to get natural hedge. The exporter here, when the exporter understand there is a appreciation of domestic currency, the exporter can find a importer and try to match the currency inflow and outflow in such a way it get a natural hedge. So, the domestic currency appreciate, if the domestic currency appreciate against the contracted foreign currency, the export oriented company should pay its obligation in foreign currency in equivalent amount. It means that when he is receiving foreign currency and he is paying foreign currency, both export import side match, and there will not be any currency fluctuation, may not be any currency surplus or currency deficit for him, and this way the natural hedging can be achieved. It can borrow or issue debt security in currency denominated in export receivable and repay interest and principal in foreign currency itself. The exporter can also, suppose he is getting receivables in foreign currency, it can create a foreign currency debt, so that the domestic financing pattern can be foreign currency oriented. When he receives foreign currency in the form of export, at that same time he should the company should be in a position to pay the foreign currency in the form of debt repayment, and this inflow outflow will be matched and natural hedge can be achieved. In this position, the exporter here receiving foreign currency, at the same time exporter for its financing of its company is creating foreign currency debt. So, debt repayment and export receivable together match, and there will not be any foreign currency operating exposure for the company. The company can also source its raw material from abroad and make payment its export denominated currency. Suppose the raw material, the export oriented company receiving foreign currency, and that is the operating exposure. Because of this, the export oriented company can source its raw material from abroad or pay the raw material price in foreign currency, and this may reduce the operating exposure. What we are doing here? We are discussing about how we can measure, how we can reduce the operating exposure because of long term financing pattern, long term receivable pattern are involved in foreign currency. Then long term financing and long term receivables are in foreign currency. If you are in a position to match the long term financing position and long term receivable position, then there may not be any foreign currency exposure, and foreign currency exposure is not there, the foreign currency operating exposure also will not be there. In nutshell, operating exposure arising out of domestic currency appreciation, it can be observed by contracting liability or payments in foreign currency or creating equal amount of foreign currency outflow. That means, what we are doing, when the export oriented company receiving foreign currency, at the same time the export oriented company creating a payment, creating a debt payment for the company in foreign currency itself. So, receivables and payment together netted out that exposure side, and foreign currency operating exposure reduce over the period. And in matching foreign currency assets and liability, what we are doing, we are absorbing some extent the operating exposure, and at the same time significant amount of operating exposure are reducing because of payments and receivables denominated in same currency are netting out. Thus, operating exposure can be managed by creating equal amount of or foreign currency debt or foreign currency payment if it is export oriented company. At the same time, if it is a import oriented company, the company can create export in such a way that equal amount of receivables are there for payment of import. In this way, the matching of cash inflow and cash outflow netted out the operating exposure. In matching of foreign currency outflow and inflow can be done by searching partner, sourcing the raw material or sourcing the payment receivable in such a way that there may not be any foreign currency gap in payment or received, and this way you can reduce the operating exposure. Other way of doing it is a risk sharing process. As we know that operating exposure arises because there is an exporter and there is an importer. If if domestic currency appreciate, it create a operating exposure. For the importer, if the foreign currency appreciate, it create a risk for the importer. In other words, for exporter, a domestic currency appreciation create a operating exposure. For the importer, domestic currency depreciation create a operating exposure. So, whenever there is a importer, there is a exporter. Whenever there is a exporter, there is a importer. That means buying and selling together going on in foreign currency in transaction process. And if the buyers and seller together share the risks of the foreign currency exposure, then the operating exposure can be absorbed by the two parties significantly. So, in the risk sharing agreement, the contractual arrangement between, there is a contractual arrangement between exporter and an importer to share the foreign currency risks. Both party knows that there will be a foreign currency appreciation or depreciation will be there, and this appreciation depreciation are beyond the control of the individual company. Let us share the risks of currency, and this way the risk sharing can reduce the operating exposure significantly. In a risk sharing agreement, both buyers and seller jointly work, so that the benefit or any kind of loss of exchange rate fluctuation shared by both parties. Both parties generally allow the natural or normal depreciation or appreciation of currency, and if the currency appreciate or depreciate beyond the natural or beyond the normal process, they try to share the risks of foreign currency. In the agreement itself, they mention that if the foreign currency depreciate or appreciate beyond certain level or certain percentage, say 10, maybe around more than 5%, then the beyond the 5%, whatever the risks will be there, that risks will be absorbed by two party. In the risks of appreciation of domestic currency is shared by the foreign counterparty by increasing the price partly, and the domestic party absorb the rest amount by increasing efficiency and reducing operational cost. So, if the suppose there is up to 5%, they allow the foreign currency appreciation depreciation. If it is more than 5%, suppose, then both parties try to absorb this in a two different process. If it is exporter, the exporter try to absorb the risks by reducing the overall cost of production, by improving the supply chain process, by improving the efficiency of the its own company, and the importer company try to absorb this by increasing the price of the import partly, and in this process both the company address the operational risks by risk sharing basis. If you go through the risk sharing process, you will find the risk sharing nowadays the common phenomenon in actual market. Risk sharing generally both parties do mention in their contract document, and that the contract document itself inbuilt flexibility there, so that in single party should not get undue advantage or disadvantage because of currency fluctuation. And this kind of risk sharing agreement take place when there is a long term arrangements are there between the two party, and two party are interdependent, because one party use the raw materials of another party and another party use the foreign currency for its own operational system. So, in the risk sharing is beneficial for two party, and they try to address the foreign currency exposure or operating exposure by having a contracted document. The contract document generally have a inbuilt flexibility. The inbuilt flexibility allows the two party to share the risks or share the benefit together. If you find the risk sharing agreement can happen only when buyers and seller enter into a long term contract, because 1 month, 2 month export import or short term arrangement may not be in a position to go for a risk sharing agreement. Because of this reason, whenever there is a long term arrangement is there between two parties, they share the risks in the contract document itself. The exporter manufacture certain product keeping the importer's requirement. At the same time, importer actively participate in exporter design, production process, manufacturing process, so that exporter is able to supply product at a cheaper rate. Both importer and exporter together, they decide their operational activity, they decide the pricing process, they share the knowledge among themselves, they participate in their own both company manufacturing process, and they know that if the overall price reduce, they can absorb the operating exposure, and in this way the document of risk sharing prepared by the two party and try to address the issue of operating exposure. If you see this operating exposure through risk sharing, it is a negotiation document. The negotiation document generally available for both party, and they try to renegotiate whenever their advantage disadvantage arises. So, the negotiating document itself is a what is called inbuilt flexibilities are there for addressing the issue of operating exposure. This type of risk sharing generally found in case of big manufacturing company, where the company generally outsource the spare parts or other non-essential component of low cost component to low cost cheap labor country. If you see at present worldwide the outsourcing issues is there, worldwide the non-essential or less technology oriented process are being outsourced from developed country to developing country, and both the company in developed and developing country, they depends upon each other in outsourcing process, and they share the risks of any kind of appreciation and depreciation of foreign currency. And the outsourcing or long term arrangement between two company provide a avenue for risk sharing, and the risk sharing process reduce the overall cost of production, and at the same time reduce the operating exposure. There are other way of managing foreign currency operating exposure also. The back to back or parallel loan, one such kind of instrument or process which allow for reducing the operating exposure. In back to back or parallel loan, two company in different country borrow offsetting amount from one another in each other currency. Here two parties are involved, the two party borrow each other domestic currency, and in such a way there will be any depreciation or appreciations are there, it will net it out in the payment or receivable itself. For example, an Indian company imports high end perfumes and cosmetic product from US and sells in India. It operates a branch office in USA to procure cosmetic product and export it to India. Let us name this company as Indian importer. The Indian importers major expenses are in US dollar, while earnings are in Indian rupee. The Indian exporter gives loan to branch office of Indian importer. The Indian importer gives an equivalent amount of loan in INR or Indian rupee to Indian exporter. If INR appreciate, then the Indian importer need to repay less amount in US dollar, while the Indian exporter gets same less amount in rupee and equalize the payment stream. Here both party handle the both currency, and whenever there is a payments receivable, both party together make the payment, make the receivable, and whenever the currency appreciate, the party which export it get less amount. At the same time, the party also import he also pay less amount. So, in this process the offsetting amount of cash flow comes, and offsetting amount of cash flow negate the any kind of operating exposure. However, this kind of back to back or parallel loan very difficult to do, because some extent you may not be in a position to do this kind of activity because of legal reason. It may happen that you may not find some kind of a party which export, also that party imports, because it may happen that a party may be only export oriented, a party may be only import oriented, and this back to back parallel loan process may not be feasible in that case. However, there are many MNCs are there, they export in one currency, at the same currency they also import. So, for them it is possibilities are there to go for a back to back parallel loans for managing the operating exposure. There are other way of doing the operating exposure management also, that is called re-invoicing center. If you see at present many MNCs have many subsidiaries, the MNC also spread over different countries, they transact in not only one currency, but multiple currency. Their export imports are also in multiple currency, multiple location. So, for them the ideal way of handling the operating exposure is to establish what is called a re-invoicing center, a centrally located re-invoicing center, that they try to address the issue of operating exposure by not directly selling or directly receiving from the respective country, but through the re-invoicing center. The re-invoicing center acts as a hedging center for managing the operating exposure arising out of multiple currency transaction process, multiple currency payment system, multiple currency receiving system, and multiple currency appreciation and depreciation process. If you see the re-invoicing center, why you need this? Re-invoicing center requires a presence of intermediary between buyers and seller. The buyers and seller act through a intermediary. The intermediary is nothing but a central invoicing center. The seller first sell the good to the intermediary. The intermediary pay the seller in home currency. That means the seller, even though it is exporter, he is not receiving in foreign currency, rather he is receiving the payment in its own domestic currency, but he is not directly selling to the party, indirectly is selling to the party, it is selling the goods to the intermediary, an intermediary making the payment in domestic currency to the seller. The intermediary in turn sell the goods to the buyer and collect the foreign currency. The intermediary, after receiving the goods from the seller, sell it to the buyer and collect the foreign currency. If there is any exposure of foreign currency is there, the intermediary absorbs the exposure. If it is a positive, it is a benefit for them, for the intermediary. If negative, it also try to address the operating exposure through other way. However, the seller of the foreign currency, the manufacturer company is not having any foreign currency exposure, because it not getting the payment in foreign currency, rather it getting the payment in its own domestic currency. The seller directly ships the goods to the buyer, but payment received is channelized through the intermediary. Seller is selling the goods to intermediary, however, in only invoicing the goods, but actually the ship of the goods are transported from the seller to the direct location of the buyers. The re-invoicing center deals with each buyer and each seller in their home currency only. The role of invoicing center increases substantially for a MNC, because MNC incomes or expenses or the buying or selling or receiving and payment in not only one currency, not only from one place, but multiple currency and multiple geographical location. However, the MNC is not going, MNC, that manufacturing company, is not facing any kind of what is called operating exposure. The operating exposure is managed by the central invoicing center, and central invoicing center have the what is called all information all about the foreign currency exposure. They are receiving different currency, they are also paying in different currency. So, then they are in a position to net it out the foreign currency appreciation or depreciation or payment and receive in such a way that the impact of what is called operating exposure is very minimum for the MNC, because the invoicing center have a lot of information and they have significant amount of foreign currency payment and receivable. They have multiple currency payment, multiple currency receipt, and this payment and receipt is spread over the year, and they know how much they are supposed to pay in one currency, how much they are supposed to pay receive in one currency, and they try to address the issue of operating exposure in such a way. The operating exposure should have minimum impact on the MNC itself. Nowadays, many MNC have centralized clearing houses, because they have, and this centralized clearing houses is generally considered as a re-invoicing center. The centralized clearing houses take care the payment receivables of MNC company, and MNC only manufacturing the goods and services and sell it directly to the intermediary, and invoicing they are getting the payment in domestic currency only. So, there may not be exposure for them in their own, if exposure in form of operating exposure. They are not affected by the appreciation or depreciation of foreign currency, and the MNC, the central invoicing center of MNC, take care the operating exposure for the company itself. If you there are other way of what is called diversification also there, because re-invoicing or matching cash flows or what is called payment back to back, these are some extent directly affect what is called the operating exposure, or directly address the question of operating exposure. There are other way of handling the operating exposures also there. These are indirect way. This indirect way nothing but changing the company operational activity, and it may be called strategic management of the company, because end of the day the operating exposure affects the value of the company, and there should be strategic decision to reduce the impact of operating exposure. And the strategic decision comes from the diversification of the company, not only the financing pattern, but also the operational system procedure also. And the diversification generally the companies are doing as a strategic decision process, because they are either export oriented or they are maybe import oriented company. Any fluctuation of foreign currency beyond the normal process affect the value of the company, affect the competitiveness of the company, and this need to be addressed through strategic decision process. And your strategic decision may be classified into two parts. One part is called diversification of operation, another part is called diversification of financing pattern. Diversification of operation is to minimize the impact of forex exposure. The exposure may be in the form of foreign currency operating exposure, maybe foreign currency transaction exposure, maybe foreign currency translation exposure. The foreign any kind of exposure, it affect negatively for the company, and in the long run if the exposure continue, it affect the competitiveness of the company. So, we have to address the question of or the impact of foreign currency exposure through strategic decision making process. To minimize the impact of foreign currency exposure or risks, a company can diversify its operation by diversifying the sales, starting new production facility, shifting the sourcing of raw material and multiple selling unit. It means that company realize that there is operating exposure, and this operating exposure need affecting the company in the long run. So, we have to take strategic decision so as to minimize this exposure, and this strategic decision may be in the form of diversification of sales, maybe in the form of starting new production facility where the domestic currency appreciation depreciation is very less, or shifting some parts of the production process to a low cost country, shifting the raw material sourcing of raw material from the appreciated currency to a depreciated currency area. Maybe multiple selling unit can establish in place of exporting into one country, they can go for exporting into multiple country in multiple currency itself. If the domestic currency is going to appreciate progressively against the US dollar, then the domestic company can focus on more on selling euro or yen market. They can also diversify from US dollar to other currency side, because by it may not be possible for a domestic currency to appreciate depreciate for all currency. Maybe one or two currency might be appreciating depreciating, some other currency may not be appreciating, may not be depreciating, or may not be affecting the company. So, company can diversify this operational system in such a way that if it is a euro currency, US dollar is appreciating or depreciating, the export oriented company can export the product to euro area. If euro is depreciating, then it can diversify, it can go for yen area, and in such a way the country can go for a multiple currency export, so that the domestic currency appreciation of one currency can be arrested, can be controlled. Similarly, the domestic company can increase its presence in domestic market, so that domestic appreciation of rupee, domestic appreciation of currency can be beneficial for the company. The company suppose is export oriented company, it can find a market in domestic, significant part of the market in domestic market, so that domestic appreciation of currency can be beneficial for the company. Similarly, if the cost of imported raw material is increasing due to progressive depreciation of home currency, the company starts searching for a new source of raw material supply, because raw material here if it is available in other currency area, other geographical location, and in different currency denomination, then company can also search for getting such kind of raw material at cheapest possible cost. Similarly, if a company can also shift production from one country to another country depending on where it is able to produce the cheaper rate, because it may happen the company cost is increasing because of appreciation of domestic currency. Company can source a part or entire production process can be shifted to other country, because the operating exposures are long term in nature. So, a long term decision making process required, because shifting the production process from one country to another country is a long term decision, and operating exposure is a long term decision. So, this can be addressed through shifting the production process also. You have to understand that diversification operation is a long term phenomenon, and this, since operating exposure can be brought in by decision at a strategic level and are having long term bearing on the profitability of the company. Since the operating exposure affect the profitability of the company in the long run. So, we have to take a what is called stringent decision in managing the operating exposure by relocating the plant, by shifting the raw material sources, by shifting the what is called sourcing the raw material from different sources, by changing the market, by going for different geographical area of export, different currency area of export. That is, all these are long term decision, and the long term decision need to be taken because operating exposure affect the long term profitability of the company. The sustenance of the company in the long run depends upon how we are absorbing the operating exposure or how we are managing the operating exposure, and this operating exposure management is a long term decision making process, and this because of this reason diversification operation should also be considered as a part of management of operating exposure. Similarly, we can also go for what is called diversifying the financing pattern of the company, because operating exposure can be absorbed or by reducing what is called the overall cost of the company, because when the domestic currency is appreciating and the company is losing the market because of appreciation domestic currency, companies should reduce the overall cost of production, and one part of the overall cost of production is the fund cost. If the company in a position to get the fund at cheap cost, there will be avenue for the company to reduce the operating cost also. By reducing the operating cost, the company can absorb significant part of the operating exposure. Similarly, one such way to changing the financing pattern of the company is to reduce the fund cost of the company. Since domestic currency is appreciating, the company can change its financing pattern by sourcing the finance from the low cost fund market, that is low cost international market, that is euro bond, yen bond, Yankee bond are such kind of bonds available in the international market at low cost. Many Indian companies to have raised the fund low cost from the foreign currency market so as to reduce the overall cost of production and overall cost of funds, and this once you reduce the overall cost of fund, there is avenue for the company to reduce the cost of production also, because end of the day you have to manufacture the good at lowest possible cost, because to get the export competitiveness you have to sell the price in the world market at the cheapest possible cost, and the operating exposure may not allow the company to reduce the cost, but it is possible increase the price. However, if the company in a position to reduce the cost through the diversification of financing pattern, then the company can continue to enjoy the export competitiveness in the market. So, another way of managing the operating exposure is the diversification of financing pattern, and by sourcing the low cost fund from the market, by reducing the overall cost of fund, and in this process increasing the efficiency of production process, and this is also one of the major reason why domestic company are getting foreign currency denominated assets, denominated liability in their balance sheet, because the foreign currency are cheaper in international market than the domestic currency. The other way of handling the foreign currency, what is the foreign currency exposure, particularly operating exposure, is through forward market, futures and options market. However, we should understand that transaction exposure can be managed through forward market, through forward contract, or through options and derivative foreign currency market. However, operating exposures are not possible to handle. Operating exposures are long term in nature. Operating exposures are very difficult to identify. These exposures are what we generally call very difficult to predict. These are uncertain exposure. If it is certain exposure, if it is exposure which can be predicted, the company can price the product in that way. However, company very difficult to identify the operating exposure, and these exposures are long term in nature, and long term nature of exposure cannot be addressed through forward contract or foreign currency options or derivative market. These are long term exposure, and long term products, forward product or risk mitigant product are not available in actual market. Only transaction exposure can be measured, can be observed or can be addressed through forward market in foreign currency area. However, this foreign operating exposure cannot be addressed through foreign currency forward, future or options contract, because long term foreign currency, this long term foreign currency fluctuation or continuous fluctuation of foreign currency in the long run cannot be addressed through forward market, because forward markets are not available beyond 6 months. Similarly, futures markets are not available more than 1 or 2 years. Similarly, options market also not available more than 1 or 2 years, and these products are not going to help in managing the or absorbing the operating exposure. Operating exposure need to be addressed through what is called management aspect, through reinventing, through changing the operational activity, changing the financing pattern, sourcing the raw material from cheap cost, through multiple export unit, through geographical diversification of production, and not through what is called financial product like forwards, future or options or currency futures. These are not possible to help us in managing the operating exposure. After discussing this, let us go for a minor example. This example we have discussed in earlier session, that is session number 21, when you discuss about the management of what is called the quantification of foreign currency exposure. We have discussed this example. This example is here, an Indian company has agreed to supply 15,000 unit of pen drive to Walmart. Walmart has agreed to pay $8 per piece of pen drive. On the date of contract, the spot rate was 51 rupees per dollar. Direct cost of manufacturing per unit of pen drive is 350 rupees. The fixed cost per manufacturing plant is 400,000 Indian rupee per year, and the manufacturing base has the capacity to manufacture 20,000 pen drive in a year. If INR appreciate from 51 to 48 rupees, what would be the level of operating exposure and how the company manage the operating exposure? This question we have discussed in the earlier session, but we have discussed by identifying the quantity, what is the quantum of operating exposure. Today we will be discussing in this session what is the qualitative way of answering this question, how we can measure, how we can observe or manage the operating exposure in a qualitative way. This answer will be, as we discuss here, The problem give us that there is a INR is appreciating, that is Indian rupee is appreciating, hence the domestic company is losing the competitive power and also its export volume. If it increases the price, if the company increase the price to absorb the operating exposure, that is INR is appreciating. So, there is operating exposure. To absorb this operating exposure, the company increase the price from $8 to $10, it may lose the market further, the export volume will further suffer. So, there is no way the company can increase the price of the exportable goods. So, it has to diversify the operating system. Here diversification means the company has to address how to reduce the cost of production, how to improve the efficiency of production system, how to source the raw material or get the raw material at cheapest possible cost, how to outsource the production process so that it can produce the pen drive lowest possible cost, how to improve the manufacturing efficiency and delivering efficiency. These are the theoretical side the company has to discuss and take drastic step to reduce the overall cost of production. Only by reducing the overall cost of production, the company can improve its sell the product at cheapest possible, and at the same time company can address the problem of operating exposures. And the theoretical answer to this is that company has to source this raw material from different sources, company has to produce at lowest possible cost, company has to finance its export in such a way the cost of export, cost of what is called the fund will be reduced, company can pay lowest possible wage, then company can also go for multiple location of export, company pay diversify the geographical area export. In place of exporting in US dollar, company can denominate the export in other currency, where against which the domestic currency, the INR, has not appreciated. In this way the company can absorb the operating exposure. There are some short questions I have mentioned here, you can discuss the short question, explain with example what are the main differences between operating and transaction exposure. As this question answer is operating exposure long term in nature, operating exposure change the value of the company, operating exposure very difficult to identify, operating exposure need to be managed and addressed through strategic decision. However, transaction exposure short term in nature, affect the each and every aspect of transaction of the company. The transaction exposures are very easily identified, and this can be observed, transaction exposure can be observed through what is called forward market, currency forward market, or purchasing any kind of currency risk mitigant instrument. How company manage their operating exposure? As we discussed, company can manage the operating exposure by reinventing, by matching cash flow statement, by sourcing the what is called risk sharing process. The company can also manage the operating exposure by through operational diversification, through financial diversification. You can discuss, we have discussed this, you can write that. Why operating exposure is also known as strategic, economic and competitive exposure. We have discussed that operating exposure affects the value of the company, operating exposure need to be addressed through strategic decision by shifting the raw material, shifting the plant machinery, by shifting the sourcing the raw material from different source, by outsourcing the product, outsourcing the production process, by changing the technology, by changing the diversification of the export. And these are the strategic decision, and this for that reason operating exposure also known as strategic exposure. And operating exposure affect long term profitability of the company, and it affects the competitiveness of the company, and because of this reason is known as this operating exposure also known as competitive exposure. What is the risk sharing agreement? What aspect party must take precaution while executing a risk sharing agreement? we discussed that risk sharing agreement is one of the process to reduce the operating exposure, and this process in this risk sharing agreement two parties share the risks and the risks of operating exposure, that is currency appreciation depreciation. They should develop they should share the agreement say in such a way that there will be inbuilt flexibility for two party. Whenever there is appreciation and depreciation, both parties should share the risk, and whenever there is a beneficial of appreciation depreciation, both parties should share the benefit also. And this the agreement should be mentioned that the negotiation should be open, negotiation should be taken care whenever there is a requirements are there. They can renegotiate for the agreement whenever there is a beneficial or difficulties are there in executing the contract. What roles reinvesting center play in management of operating exposure? What we discussed the reinvesting center. Reinvesting center is a central agency to take care the operating exposure of the company. They all operating exposure, that is payment and receivables, pass through the reinvesting center, and they get the foreign currency receivables and payment, and they manage the foreign currency exposure by netting out the payments and receivable in such a way the impact of operating exposure to the company is very minimum. And you can go through the references I mentioned here: International Financial Management by Yoon and Resnick, International Financial Management by Jeffrey Madura, in Multinational Financial Management by Alan Shapiro. These three books I have referred in my discussion process. You can go through the book. Thank you.